Hello and welcome to The Print. Today we have with us Zorawar Daulet Singh. He's a scholar as well as an author, but he is an expert in India's foreign policy, written extensively on India-China issues, on global issues, and he's also affiliated with the Institute of Chinese Studies. Welcome to The Print, Mr. Singh, and thank you once again for talking to us.
Thank you, Nayanima. Thanks for The Print for hosting this discussion.
Thanks a lot. So I would like to show your book, which was there in 2019, but now it is an updated edition. It is in paperback, Power and Diplomacy, India's Foreign Policies During the Cold War. This is just for our readers and our listeners. It's a fantastic book, and it just sort of, talks about how India's foreign policy looked like during the Cold War era, but it has so much relevance, even in today's foreign policy that India is having, and also the kind of geopolitical tensions we are having, Mr. Singh. So let me just start by asking you, since you have dealt so much on this, there is this thing going on right now also with the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Many are calling it as a Cold War 2.0, and the fact that there are many other scholars who are saying we never came out of the Cold War era, so to say. Also, especially Mr. Biden being the US president who's being, called as having this Cold War hangover. But what are your thoughts on it, and what does your research say?
Yeah, so in fact, it's interesting, this phase of confrontation that we're seeing between the West, the US and Russia is in fact even beyond what the first Cold War was. The first Cold War, if you recall, was an ideological competition, a geopolitical competition, but there were certain rules. It was restrained by a balance of power. Both sides, in a sense, knew where to draw the line. They never engaged in confrontation on each other's peripheries, their core interests. In a sense, the world had been carved up into these spheres. In this case, what we're seeing is you're seeing the US, NATO, trying to establish a foothold on the Russian periphery, and the Russian reaction to that, which of course, as we've seen, is absolutely ferocious, and they're trying to roll that back, which has led to this confrontation. So in some ways, when scholars and students of the Cold War look at this contemporary situation, it looks even more dangerous, because the prospect of escalation into a nuclear confrontation, which of course is we're not close to that, but the possibility is far more dangerous than what we ever sort of got to during the first Cold War, other than a few crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. Other than that, there was a sense of restraint. Of course, there were a lot of proxy wars, which were extremely violent and costly for the third world, for the global south. But the great powers never directly collided with each other, the US and the Russians, which they are now in some sense involved with in Ukraine.
So what you are saying is that today, do you think the situation is much more dangerous than what it was during the actual Cold War?
So in some ways, it is of course very dangerous, and it's also, we're finding it difficult to reach some kind of an equilibrium or a situation where these major powers can coexist. The Cold War 1.0, there was, at the end of the day, a competitive coexistence. You didn't like the other side, but you had to learn to live with it, because you knew that your survival as an entity depended on some kind of assurance of security to the other side. In this case, we're seeing the West particularly absolutely oblivious of the possible consequences of this confrontation. And we're seeing European economies in shambles. We're seeing even the US facing a recession. And of course, look at the impact on the rest of us, right? In India, in the rest of the developing world, facing high commodity prices, global instability, globalization further fractured. I think there's that sense of responsibility that the superpowers had in the Cold War is missing today. And I think this is where I suppose other powers, to some extent, should be stepping in to try and shape a more conducive environment for dialogue, for conversations, because even amidst all the hostility, at least when Indians have faced this kind of competition with its neighbors, we've been advised to engage in dialogue, engage in some sort of communication to calm things down. I think it's time that we sort of gave that advice to our Western interlocutors as well.
Mhm. Well, that's a valid thing what you've told, Mr. Singh, that that sense of responsibility is sort of missing today in this two powers, be the US or Russia. But also, we saw the impact of the Cold War 1.0. We saw how USSR sort of completely got shattered, and that ideology of communism suffered a setback. But today, do you see? Apart from the sense of responsibility, also do you see things that are much more dangerous because there is another player like China in the game?
So certainly, if you look at, let's say, the 1960s, which I would trace was the beginning of this multipolar world that we're seeing, which is far more prominent today, when the Sino-Soviet relationship kind of fell apart, and you saw Eurasia having multiple power centers. Today, of course, China is has already become into a major great power with a powerful economy and perhaps a growing military as well. So I think the question you're asking is it more dangerous to some extent? What we see are two different fronts really today. We're seeing a US-China front in the Western Pacific, which has not reached a level of confrontation, but there's certainly glimpses of what the future could behold. Would it be like the 1950s where you had two major conflicts where the Chinese and the Americans sort of almost directly collided, the Korean War, the Vietnam War? I don't know if we'll get that far, but certainly there are areas like, for example, the Taiwan Straits where there is a possibility that should things go beyond this sort of complex equilibrium that's being created, we could see some sort of an escalation. We're not there yet, of course. And of course, the other front, as you opened with, is what's happening in parts of Western Eurasia, this sort of post-Cold War space where you see the Russians trying to reclaim influence, and NATO, in a sense, is trying to preserve onto the gains of what it felt it had earned by winning the first Cold War. So you're seeing everyone, in a sense, revising the rules of the game, trying to sort of maximize their power, maximize their spheres, and this period is not going to, of course, end with the Ukraine conflict, and it's going to carry on until all the major players, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and perhaps the regional powers like India, Iran, others, all come to some sort of an understanding of what this multipolar world, what will be the rules of the game. I think really this is a contest of what the post-unipolar world will look like. India, of course, will be a major player in that, where it's located, because of its size, because of its history, because of its quest to maintain its own strategic independence, which gives it a lot of leverage in this international environment. But what you choose to do with that, I think those are the debates really Indians have been having. And in this book, in a sense, is also a contribution to that debate to some extent.
Interesting that you speak about India, because that's what I was also referring to this from your book, where you talk about shock to South Asia's balance of power during the Cold War 1.0. But also, even today, if you see, and if you really take this as Cold War 2.0 or any which way, there is just so much question about India's strategic autonomy, right? The West is constantly seeking ways to ensure that India takes a certain stance. We know that what India has said, that it is only dialogue and diplomacy, and it has clearly steered away from supporting any one country, be it Russia or Ukraine. So do you think that kind of dichotomy, you would say, or maybe the dilemma, whichever way you want to put it, is still there in India's foreign policy, A, and B, is that beneficial to India in the longer run, especially in today's day and age?
So that's a great question. I think we've been facing this. So let me step back and say this idea of alignment and non-alignment, this entire agenda setting, or this conversation of where India's place should be in the world, has really been set by outsiders, right? I mean, we go back to the 1950s, the question was asked, are you aligned with us or are you against us? If you're not aligned with us, then who are you aligned with? Which block are you going to play a role in? So the idea that there could be an independent India, which non-alignment really, or non-aligned, was a is a term that expresses that, right? That we are independent. I think that idea took so long to take root across both blocks, but the West particularly took an even longer time because of the imperial colonial legacy that they had. I mean, their image of a an international community is you have a handful of few Western states and the rest sort of, orbit around that hierarchy. So in the sense, we've been facing this kind of dichotomy, as you said, that are you aligned, are you not aligned? And till this day, I mean, you look at recent interventions in our op-eds and commentaries, we're still responding to this idea that are you going to be aligned or not aligned? And Indian policymakers kind of are so defensive and they're stuck in this kind of game that they're not able to go beyond this. Of course, we're going to be not aligned. Of course, you're going to be independent, right? What is the next step? What are you going to do with that? What role are you going to play? So I think my book was, of course, about a different part of strategic history during the 50s, 60s, 70s. And I think one of the main themes that I've tried to bring out was India was non-aligned right through the Cold War, in a sense. It was independent. But what it did with that differed across those eras, right? So in the Nehru period, you had a particular vision of international security, of Asian security, and India played a role in sort of, bridging the divides between the superpowers, between the US and China. That role changed in the 60s and 70s, where India kind of stepped back and started focusing on its immediate periphery. It kind of gave up on the big powers, saying that you guys have to sort out your differences. We're going to sort of take care of ourselves. So and what we are seeing now in the last 30 years, it is in some sense a continuation of that, but we're still struggling to find a role in this post-unipolar world. Like to say that we are independent is fine, but what are you going to do with that? Because the moment you don't go to that next step, you're going to continue to keep facing these pressures of being pulled in one direction or the other. So maybe one role could be that you're going to try and promote the interests of global South, as it's been called, or play a role in stabilizing Asian security, right? After all, you're placed in a situation where you're away from the main theater of Sino-American intense competition, which is in East Asia, Taiwan Straits, Japan, Korea, etc. So are you going to play a stabilizing role there? What about trying to craft the post-globalization era? What is the kind of connections that you want to build with the European economies, Eurasia, Russia, Iran? Where will the energy sector links flow? I mean, there's so many areas on developmental discourse. So all these themes are, in a sense, hard reflecting in India's foreign policy, but I don't think we have articulated an overarching vision of what India's role should be in this emerging multipolar world, other than maintaining our independence. That, of course, is a given, right? So, and if somebody says that, are you aligned or not aligned? I mean, that question should now be set aside. It's what do you do with that independence?
Okay, well, that's very interesting, and probably time will only tell the answer as to where India wants to go from here next, because now we are going to be the president of G20, and so many I mean, there are this op-eds coming out that India should speak for global South, and that's what the government has also said. But then coming back to your book again, you've dealt a lot with the way former Prime Minister and independent India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, sort of steered the foreign policy at that time. This is also the year when, we've completed 60 years of the 1962 Indo-China War.
I think there was a lot more contingency. There were different choices that both sides could have made. There could have been situations where they could have chosen to modulate their competition, exit from some of those escalatory kind of situations that they have found themselves in. So I think the idea that India and China, after all, I mean, you're talking of these two independent powers before the 1940s, really not even engaging each other in a direct sense, right? You had the Western powers in Asia, both in China, India, of course, completely colonized. So this idea that they're going to develop a relationship really starts to take root in the 1940s. So it's in fact, it hasn't been a really long time, right? It's only been 70 years where they still have not really come to terms with each other as neighbors. And that process of trying to come to some sort of an understanding of even coexistence is going to take a bit longer. But I think from an Indian perspective, Certainly, there were mistakes, you could say, that the Indian side made in the late 50s, early 60s, in not managing the dispute with China a little better, because you didn't have to find yourself in an armed confrontation. The Chinese, of course, also from our perspective, did not look at some of Indian interests as seriously as we think they should have. They didn't look at the border security. They didn't look at how the Cold War was impacting us. They had their own sort of struggles with the Soviets and the Americans. So there was a mismatch of expectations. And I think there was also an asymmetry of power as well, which we see today, right? I mean, this India for the last 30 years or last 10 years particularly has again struggling to get the Chinese to look at Indian interests seriously. And there is an imbalance. There's a disparity of power, of status, both in how they look at each other and themselves. And that, of course, has tended to create frictions and problems. And there's no easy way out of it. One sort of theory out there is that until India becomes stronger, things will not stabilize. But that process is endless, right? I mean, you're talking of a decades-long journey. But what about that period between now to when India has achieved this so-called great power status, which we don't know when it will come? You still have to find yourself, and you have to create policies. You have to create a particular approach to your neighborhood, to Asia, where you find yourself not in confrontation with the Chinese, right? Because that's something where you lose as well, and they lose as well. So what is that foreign policy? I think I wouldn't say the Indian side in the last decade, 2 decades, has completely failed in that quest or that endeavor. I think they are finding ways to do that, but I still think we are still a bit defensive in trying to find that there's not a sense of a proactive approach to manage the China relationship, right? You're going to have competition, you're going to have disputes, but you also have these other areas where we used to believe we could have collaboration. Why can't we have a complex China policy that was carrying on? One reason, of course, is that this crisis on the border in the last 2 years has completely disrupted that old consensus. But at some point, I think both the leaderships in Delhi and Beijing will have to pick up where they left off and try to solve even the questions on the boundary, or at least to manage this latest friction, and also pick up some of the broader themes of the India-China relationship, because it's just too important a bilateral relationship to be just left or unattended to. It's like each side is just brushing it and kicking the can down the road. I don't know if that's really a smart foreign policy, really. Especially if our old approach of relying on the West or the Americans to manage Asian security is no longer as reliable, right? They've got their own problems in the Western Hemisphere. They've got their hands tied up in so many different issues. Are they really going to be there to manage your problems? So I think we have to now be a little more proactive in how we handle our great power relationships. We're doing it quite well with the Russians, with the West. I think with China as well, we're going to have to now find some way to resume a bigger conversation that covers everything, even the areas that we don't agree on.
But will that be sort of that easier, Mr. Singh? Because looking at the fact that how closely India is now strategically aligned with the US, doing any kind of having any kind of closeness with China always invites the so-called US pressures, and also the fact that with China and the voices that we hear especially for the last 2 years since the border tensions began and the Galwan clash, is the fact that the relationship cannot go back to what it used to be, and there has to be peace and tranquility in the border areas.
So one of the things we've seen is coming to the subcontinent is, as China is getting more distracted with its East, with this rising competition or uncertainty in the relationship between the US and its allies in China, the space for India to sort of try to sort of integrate the subcontinent, expand its economic influence, help its neighbors sort of grow, offer options. I think that opportunity is now again coming back, because if you notice, a decade ago, even 5 years ago, there was this very ambitious Chinese policy in South Asia, the Belt and Road, was one part of that. But the broader theme was that China is going to sort of overwhelm India in the subcontinent. I think we've seen that hasn't really happened for lots of reasons. But now with China looking east, looking inwards, managing its political sort of transition, there's a whole lot of stuff that they are engaged with. We should be looking at this opportunity to sort of even improve the conditions in the subcontinent. I think that's something which can be done, and perhaps it is being done to some extent.
Mhm. And also, if you talk about, in your book, you discuss a lot about the military heft that India had at that point of time, during the Cold War. Do you think today the scenario has somewhat changed and the Chinese recognize the fact that today is India much more stronger militarily?
So it depends on how we define military power for what purposes. I think India today, obviously, given that it's a nuclear weapon state, it has the ability to uh, uh, have a retaliatory posture against other regional nuclear weapon states. It has a pretty robust regional navy. It has land forces that are equipped with advanced weaponry, of course, because of the relationship, unique one we have with the Russians. So we have the ability today to produce security for ourselves. I'm not saying we can send Indian troops further afield, but I don't see any reason why we should be doing that. If our main security problems are on our frontiers in the neighborhood, I think for that we are in a reasonable position of being able to manage our security. I think the question really comes now is in terms of reforms. How are you going to reform the armed forces and the whole host of bureaucratic uh, civil military issues in terms of efficiency. But I think on the whole, I think we have an adequate level of military power. Now, if you start comparing Indian power to Chinese power, obviously there's an imbalance, right? But I don't really see India requiring that level of military superiority or parity with the Chinese. Their security considerations are very different, right? They engage with a superpower competition with the United States, the number one military power in the world. We aren't, right? So do we need that kind of a military? Do we need to divert funds from development into this oversized military machine? We don't face those security problems, right? Ours are more limited. So I know there's a big debate out there, but I think it's a false debate. Catching up with China militarily, we don't need that level of power. They're faced with a much more complicated front in the Western Pacific, and for that, even then, for the last 20 years, they were far more restrained in converting their economic wealth into military strength. They've only started it in the last 10 years to really sort of try to leapfrog and catch up with the West. Of course, it's going to still take a long, long time. But as far as Chinese security requirements are concerned, I think they are in a position where they can take care of their core interests, whether it's in Taiwan, in Korea, in the South China Sea. We don't have those problems. So I think the question should be asked is, do we have a military power adequate enough when we combine it with our great power relationships to produce security in the subcontinent for our core interests? I believe we do.
Mhm.
With sound, sensible statecraft, I think we're in a position to manage that.
Mhm. Also, since you've mentioned Taiwan several times during this interaction, and that's what the US is now hugely focusing on, do you think India should be concerned with the Taiwan crisis? Do you actually see US going completely, looking at focusing on Taiwan and probably with an intervention?
It's actually interesting. I have one chapter in this book on the first Taiwan state crisis, which was in
Right.
1954, 55. And if you sort of go at the kind of rhetoric and language being used by both sides at the time, and India, of course, was playing this role to calm things down. I mean, you had the Secretary of State at the time, U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and even President Eisenhower actually talking of the use of tactical nuclear weapons should a crisis in the Taiwan Strait come out into the open. I don't think we are reached at that level of. So there's a lot more, you could say, pragmatism on both sides of the strait and in Washington and Beijing. I don't see that level of escalation, unless, of course, there'd be some kind of a dramatic change in the status quo by any one side. Then all bets are off. But other than that, we aren't in a situation where it should sort of get out of control. But then again, you're faced with some reckless sort of policymakers on all sides at times, and particularly in the West, we see sometimes they just are losing sense of all proportion of reality. So that level of statesmanship, I think, which was there in the first Cold War, is missing today, and that should come back, because you don't take things for granted when the stakes are so high, right?
That's true. And also, you in this book, you talk about the Vietnam War as well. And, today we see there is this clear demarcation within the ASEAN in terms of who falls in the China camp and which all countries fall in the US camp within these 10 countries. But then India also, has neglected ASEAN a lot. I mean, only just a few trade, and probably we did one free trade agreement, which is also not yielding good results. But then now we talk of ASEAN centrality. We've woken up to the fact, after a little nudge from the US, and we now talk about ASEAN centrality within Indo-Pacific. But do you see that ASEAN is now going to play a massive role, something that India should really, seriously focus on?
So the ASEAN's worldview, in a sense, Southeast Asia today, is really that they don't want to choose a side, right? So they're going back by the kind of ideas that India used to propagate in the 50s, in Bandung, and the idea that they're going to be these areas on the interstices between the great powers that will remain to have good ties with both sides. So I think ASEAN has kind of picked that up, and it's enshrined it into its foreign policy doctrines. And you see it all the time, right? The ASEAN way, so to speak. So as far as the role that they're playing, I don't think they're really going beyond that. I don't think they're trying to stabilize ties between China and the US. I think what they're doing is they're drawing benefits from both sides: technology, investment, capital, market access. And they seem to be doing all right in terms of, you look at Vietnam, for example. I don't think the Vietnamese, of course, are conscious that they're a land neighbor of China, and they've had problems for the last 1,000 years. But at the same time, they maintain their nationalism, they maintain their autonomy, they maintain positive ties with the Chinese, but they also have deep strategic relationships with other parts of the world. India itself is playing an important role in helping Vietnam modernize its military, manage some of its armed forces. So I think the Southeast Asians have kind of course, their neighborhood is far more dangerous. They're in even closer proximity to the Chinese and the US and its allies. So I think they found a way that works for them. I don't know if that works for us, because we have a land neighbor in China, but we don't have anybody else on the other side to kind of offset that. So we're going to have to manage ties with China. And there are, of course, areas where we can draw from ASEAN, where you can draw in capital, draw in technology, yet have certain norms, certain rules. I mean, the stuff that we were doing for a long time, right? I think this border crisis has kind of upended some things. Now we have to sort of redefine what this relationship going forward will be. And it should be on, obviously, on mutually beneficial terms, but I don't think we should just be, just put it aside. I think there has to be a sense of a proactive approach from both sides. When that will happen is anybody's guess.
Well, interesting you say that, and that will be also my last question, although it'll require a detailed answer from you, is the fact that we now saw Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping at least exchanging pleasantries, a handshake in Indonesia on the sidelines of the G20 summit. And it is expected that probably President Xi will be coming to India for the SCO summit and then for the G20 summit. So how do you see the relationship now? Sort of, do you think, firstly, it is coming back to track, and also the fact that we saw Biden and President Xi also meeting, President Biden. There is this interesting joint statement that US and China came up with. Now, will India take a cue from that, and will it move ahead, or do you think it will have its own sort of policy to deal with China? Basically, if you look at in the next 5 years, what should be India should be doing as far as China is concerned?
Yeah. So I think one of the lessons that the Indian side drew from the first Cold War and 62 is that, yes, you've got to pursue your security interests, your border security, but I think the costs of outright confrontation are very high. And I think even the Chinese perhaps have also recognized that. So in fact, so the last 10 years, whenever we've seen border crises, we've always seen both sides ultimately pull back from the brink. Even in this latest crisis in the last 2 years, they did pull back from the brink. Of course, there was a spurt of intense violence in June 2020, but they did not let it go beyond a certain point. So I think both sides are not going to let this relationship completely unravel. And the question is, will it stay sort of simmering at this level of uncertainty, of indifference, of not a Cold War, but like you could say an apathy? Or are you going to sort of confront your problems and the opportunities for collaboration? I think also from the Chinese side, we tend to get a sense that they have not, if not given up on India, they're not really ready to look at India seriously. Part of the reason could be their own sort of prejudices of the past, their perception of India as an independent power. Some have even argued that, like you had suggested, your alignment with the West may be seen as to be so strong that they don't really look at India as an independent player. I don't know if that's, but from our part, we of course have to continue to manage and portray our sort of non-aligned status, that we are going to look at our interests as a priority and not any great power interests in the Western Pacific. I think once that is clarified, then you come down to sort of the nuts and bolts on the border, etc. But I don't think we'll solve any problems. I think we're going to keep it going along. I also see that the way globalization is completely being disrupted, and this new Eurasian political economy, you're seeing an expansion of the SCO with Iran, for example, parts of even the Middle East coming in. You could see a very different sort of geo-economic landscape coming in. Where will India be in that? And where will the India-China relationship be in that broader geo-economic landscape? Because after all, our demography, our market size, our location allows us to play a very interesting role in this broader sort of political economy that could play out. But again, that presumes that we will have some kind of a manageable relationship with Beijing.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. That has been a very interesting discussion, Mr. Singh. Once again, for our viewers, this is the book, Power and Diplomacy. This is now available in paperback. But thank you so much for talking to us, and you please take care.
Thank you so much.